This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good Friday morning, the first official day of winter. The winter solstice is upon us. Amy Jacobson here, Bruce Wolf.
Winter is coming. Winter has arrived.
Well, yes.
Game of Thrones returns next year.
Thank you.
Understand the battle scene is a battle scene that you've never seen before.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Bruce
little tease right there.
So Bruce Wolf sitting in for Dan Proft. Big news, too, this week while you've been filling in. There was no border wall funding, and then there was, and then there wasn't. And the stopgap measure, we still have, we've got our countdown clock going, 15 hours, 49 minutes, and 10 seconds.
And Mark.
Until a possible government shutdown, mostly over border wall funding. But the big news yesterday came in the afternoon when Secretary of Defense Colonel James Mattis quit, went to the White House, had a meeting with President Trump, and said that is enough. Here's Jennifer Griffin, who is the Pentagon reporter for Fox News.
This was not something that Secretary Mattis did lightly. I had been told by sources here in the Pentagon, amidst the rumors that Mattis was leaving during the past year, that he would not leave unless he was pushed out. This was not a decision he takes lightly. He clearly has been at odds with the president over a number of issues, especially if you look in the last few days, the issue of pulling all U.S. troops out of Syria. That is something that Mattis opposed. That is something that all of the top leaders here in the Pentagon, as well as the U.S. Central Command generals, opposed. I was told by a very well-placed source here in the Pentagon that morale has never been lower at meetings here at the Pentagon of the top brass in the last few days to discuss the pullout of troops from Syria.
And there's no doubt that his departure is shaking Washington and military bases across the world. And let's get the latest now from Colonel Cedric Leighton, CNN military analyst and security consultant who served as the Joint Chief Staff and the National Security Council. And Cedric, Colonel, has been on CNN all night long, so we appreciate him joining us this morning. Good morning, Colonel. Can you hear us?
I sure can, Amy. How are you doing this morning?
Good. So we all learned out, all of us at the same time, including General Mattis, that President Trump would be pulling troops out of Syria, 2,000 troops, via Twitter. And do you think that General Mattis deserved better than that, than maybe President Trump should have sat down with him and other, heads of state, or even not heads of state, but other administrators to give them the news?
Oh, definitely. And I think the key thing here, Amy, is that these kinds of moves, moving troops out of Syria, possibly moving troops out of Afghanistan, all of that requires a lot of deliberation because there are a lot of moving pieces to any of this. When you look at Syria, you've got such a complicated situation on the ground. It was complicated before we got there. It'll stay complicated when we leave, and we're going to leave at some point, regardless of how the president handles this type of thing. But this requires a lot of consultation, and in particular with the military brass, especially with Secretary Mattis, but also with our allies. And that was one of the key factors that Secretary Mattis mentioned in his resignation letter, that the treatment of allies was something that in this administration was something that bothered him quite a great deal.
Yeah, because he mentioned you can't leave your friends, the Kurds, on the battlefield alone. What will happen to them if President Trump gets what he wants?
Unfortunately, Syria is a place of worst-case scenarios. So, the picture is really bleak for the Kurds, and they have a history of having real trouble in the region that they live in. What will probably happen is that we'll see massacres. You have people who are genuinely scared for their lives because not only are they charged with fighting ISIS on our behalf, but Kurdish forces are also having to defend their towns and villages from a possible Turkish invasion. So you have, in essence, two of our allies, and the president has made the choice to pick one of our allies, the Turks, over the Kurds. And there can be legitimate reasons for that, but that is something that really has to be thought about very, very carefully before that's done.
Colonel, I'm at sixes and sevens over this whole thing. I mean, on the one hand, yes, we have destroyed the physical caliphate, but the terrorist organization still exists. And it's you can't play this whack-a-mole because the mole seems to get bigger and bigger each time you ignore it. And certainly there have been benefits with a minimal footprint put in Syria by us. I mean, we only have a couple of thousand troops there. On the other hand, what is the end game here? I mean, we're going to just wind up with handing Syria over to radical Muslims eventually. Anyway, we don't want to have a quagmire. There is something to be said, and I understand President Trump is brusque. He doesn't handle things, deliver the news in the right way. But substantively, I mean, there is something to be said for pulling out, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely, Bruce. You can make a very cogent argument that one should pull out. The problem that you have with that, though, is that once you do that, there are a whole series of dominoes that fall. And, I'm not trying to invoke the old domino theory, but in this particular case, what you're looking at is a situation where some people are down there depending on us. They are looking at, what we do, not only specifically in Syria, but they're seeing that as really a harbinger of what's going to happen next in other relationships all around the world, even outside of the Middle East. So it's a very difficult situation. But to your point, it is absolutely, a possibility that one makes a decision that now we're going to have a certain sphere of influence and Syria is not within that sphere of influence. I would argue that that would be a dangerous assumption to make, but it is certainly a legitimate assumption from a geopolitical standpoint. Then we have to realize that if we do that, that means that the Russians and the Iranians are going to gain considerable influence because, instead of ISIS being the dominant force in a large part of Syria, you will have the Assad regime as the dominant force, and that is probably going to happen anyways. But with ISIS in particular, you have a situation where you can actually see them being diminished. The caliphate, like you mentioned, is on its last legs, but that's the time when you prosecute the advantage and you go after them and finish them off. And of course, that's a very, very difficult thing to do.
Colonel, it seems that there's been great pause by both Democrats and Republicans over Mattis handing in his 2-page resignation letter. Do you have any idea who is going to take this job? And do you think he'll last until February? I mean, it said that he's going to leave at the end of February, but do you see him staying that long? And who in the world is going to take his position?
Well, that's a really good question. Every name that comes up, there's always something where either they're not confirmable, or at least it appears that they're not confirmable in the Senate, or you're in a situation where they're going to have to do a lot of convincing before they actually get there. I think you may see some member of Congress who is very closely aligned with President Trump coming into that role. People have talked about Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas as being a possible Secretary of Defense. There's and he's a military veteran, so would certainly bring that to the table. And of course, he's politically, I think, acceptable to the president, but he's also very concerned about what's going on in Syria and in Afghanistan, and his views may not align with the president's as much as the president thinks. And as far as Secretary Mattis lasting until February, I don't know. I have my doubts. Clearly, the secretary picked that date as his going away date, but that is because of things like congressional testimony, as well as meetings with allies and things of that nature, and that those are in some cases someone like President Trump may see that as just a nicety instead of as a legitimate reason for somebody to stay on. So it's very likely in my mind that the Secretary Mattis will leave before the end of February, just because that's kind of the way the president would operate. But we'll see how this all folds out at this time.
I see General Keane getting the job and you jumping over to Fox. That's just my view. But no, here's what's going to. Here's a possibility.
The man's been up all night on CNN.
I understand, and I'm taking advantage of that. Here's perhaps a not unrealistic scenario, because President Trump is known to be pliable. I mean, you just witnessed it on the continuing resolution, and now he's firm because apparently Ann Coulter and Rush Limbaugh influenced him on the wall yesterday. Is it possible, for example, that sure we withdraw the troops, but pretty soon we're making sure that we have aerial support of whoever's on the ground there, and then some of the generals say, well, we need a few boots on the ground again, and then we put them back on the ground. I mean, that's possible, right?
It's very possible, and it's a very interesting scenario. And one of the key things that we were wrestling with as we heard the news last night was, would air support actually continue? There have been over 200 airstrikes in the last week or so against ISIS positions from U.S. and coalition air forces. And one of our favorite ways of waging war nowadays is to use air power. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. And I think that the idea of once you leave, there is always the possibility of coming back. And you look at our history, across several administrations, and I do think this may not be the last that we see U.S. forces in Syria, even if the president does what he said he's going to do and withdraws the forces right now. There may be an imperative for us to go back there, and knowing that region, I would bet on that imperative taking over.
All right. Thank you so much. This is Colonel Cedric Leighton, CNN military analyst, was on all night through the network. So we thank you so much for being with us, and we really appreciate it and hope you have a very happy holidays.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. I wish you and everybody on the team at WIND a happy holiday as well.
All right. Blessings. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.